Good there, Paul. Wonderful. Good Shabbos, everybody. Parashat Mishpatim. Last week we did the 10 commandments. This week there's also loads of commandments in this week's portion. I'm going to be discussing one of the major verses in this particular portion. And tell me if you think this is coincidence. So, first of all, the rabbis of old did not make the chapters of the Torah and the verses. Our tradition is that when Moses was given the Torah, he wrote it in sentences or words next to each other, or maybe even letters next to each other, but there was no paragraph, there were no paragraphs, there were no particular chapters or verses. It was the Christians who came and gave us, thankfully, a very good reference guide. Let me make everyone mute. They gave us a reference guide of chapters and verses, which, almost every rabbi uses that I know. And I would say very accurate. Most of it, not all, in my opinion, but most of it seems pretty accurate. And it's a very good tool to use. So you tell me if this is coincidence. So there's this famous verse in this portion, which in 2 words, it says, we shall do, and then we will understand. Or we shall do, and we shall be heard, or we shall do and we shall obey. Naaseh v'nishma. It's not so easy to translate this verse. I'll go through a little bit of different opinions of what this means. I also will read you the full verse. This is in chapter 4, verse 7 of Exodus. Moses, he took the book of the covenant and read it in the ears of the people. And they said, so this is the people saying, everything that Hashem has spoke, we will do and we will obey. So Art Scroll understands it as we will do and we will obey. The rabbis of the Talmud take this very far as to say that the Jewish people accepted the Torah without knowing what's in it. They just said, God, give it to us. We'll do whatever you want us to do. And later on, we'll begin to understand why you told us to do these things. Very, very famous verse. There are many different ways of understanding it. The easiest way of understanding it, in my opinion, this seems to be what the rabbi in the Middle Ages called the Ralbag suggested. He suggested this verse that we will do and we will obey is referring to 2 different types of commandments. So we will do is referring to what's known as positive commandments, things that we're meant to do actively and positively, like give charity or go listen to the shofar being blown on Rosh Hashanah. And the nishma is somewhat, and we will obey the commandments which are negative. So we won't kill, we won't steal, we won't do all the things that we're not meant to do. That's the easiest reading. It's not so much they were accepting laws that they didn't know about. It's just that was their way of saying we'll accept the whole of the Torah, both positives and negatives. It's not the way that the majority of opinions read it. They read it that we did accept the Torah before knowing what's in it. And there's a couple of questions we could have about this. Is this being naive? Are we meant to be naive and ignorant and just accept what people tell us, what God tells us? Is that what this verse is saying? Is that the highest level? Is just obey and not know what's going on? That's one question. And then the other question is, how does that relate to trust? How much trust are you meant to have? How much naivety are you meant to have? Where is that balance? That's what we'll discuss today. Starting with the Or Sameach in his commentary on the Torah called Meshech Chochmah. I think it's from the 1800s. He notices that in the previous portion, when the people accepted God and the commandments, it just said, Na'aseh. The exact verse, it's from chapter 19, verse 8. Vayanu kol ha'am yachdav, vayamru kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh. The people said, together, that's an important word. The people said together in unison, speak and we will do whatever Hashem tells us. We will do. That verse, Na'aseh, is mentioned before on its own. Without the we will obey, just we will do. In our portion, which I just read you, it says we will do and we will obey. This commentary in the 1800s asked the questions, why does it change from just we will do to we will do and we will obey? He also is hinting at the idea that this is in plural. We will do and we will obey. People weren't saying to themselves, okay, I get it, I'll take on this responsibility. They were seemingly taking it on in plural. So what's the deal with that? He mentions that there's no Jew on this earth, no human can do it all. Even if you try to do it all, even if you wake up at 5 in the morning and you do your gym for 2 hours before Shachrit, and then you do your Shachrit, and then you do your 3 hours of visiting the sick, and then you do your 4 hours of studying the Torah, and then you do your 2 hours with your children, and then you do your next 4 hours of work, and you go all the way until 3 in the morning. Even if you do that, according to the basic Jewish understanding, you will never be able to be the infinite Jew that does everything, purely from the fact that not every commandment applies to you. There are some commandments only men can do, some only women can do, some only Kohanim or priests can do, some only farmers can do, some only in Israel, some only in the temple, etc., etc., etc. So how could the Jewish people claim that they will do whatever God's going to tell them, where it's impossible that they'll ever be able to do it all? It's almost like they were committing to something bigger than they could chew. So the Meshech HaChocham is answering that question by saying that there's two ways that you can do everything, even though you're not a Kohen, and even though you don't live in Israel, and even though, etc., etc., etc. There's two ways that you can do everything as a Jew. One is you can study what you can't do. And the rabbis thought that studying what you can't do is akin to doing it. That's why some people have the practice of reading the sacrifices in the morning and the daily prayers, or some people will study sections which are irrelevant to them. They'll learn the laws of kings, because yes, there were kings who fulfilled this for the Jewish people. You and I maybe can't do it, but learning about it is somewhat of a fulfillment of that part of the Torah. That's one way that you can do it. The other way is that you rely on your brethren. That when we said we will do it, the assumption was, I'm not going to do everything, and you're not going to do everything, and this person's not going to do everything. But as a collective, we do have the Kohanim and the women and the men and the priests and those in Israel and those outside of Israel. And if everyone is together in unison, that's the fulfillment of what it means to be a Jew en masse. So that's what the Meshech Chochmah says, and he reads it in the verses himself. He says, the first verse says, they were all together, Yachdav, the people, and they said, Na'aseh, we will do. That's talking about, they will fulfill it together based on the fact of everybody doing their part. But the second part, which said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do, and then you will understand. That's talking about you and your own obligation. It doesn't mention in unison, it just says everybody on their own said, we will do and we will obey, because you can learn about whatever you want in life. And learning about those things will somehow bring you to the consciousness of what other people would be doing from doing those things by you just learning about it. So that answers, his version of Na'aseh v'nishma is collectively, we can all do the Torah, but you and I cannot do it completely on our own. That tells you the power that other people have in our lives. And according to the Meshech HaChochmah, you can't really be a full Jew unless you're part of the nation. The nation is almost like the sum of parts, or the whole is bigger than the sum of parts. Okay, next, were we naive? Is there any big deal in being naive? Well, Abraham's told to, slaughter his son, and he just says, I'll go with it. Here we have the people saying, give us the Torah and we'll do whatever you tell us, whatever it is we'll do. It's not so clear amongst the ancient commentaries what they were saying Na'aseh to. What were they actually responding by saying, we will do this, or we will do this and understand? Rashi has the approach that they were really quite naive. He assumes that the Torah is out of order, and where they're saying that they are committing to something, they're not committing to the 10 Commandments, because the 10 Commandments hadn't been given, according to Rashi, when this particular thing was being said, because the Torah is not in chronological order. So they were only saying yes to the lessons that they'd inherited from the book of Genesis, the lessons from Adam, the lessons from Enosh, the lessons from Noah, the lessons from Abraham and the other forefathers. They were saying yes to those things that they knew about, but they weren't particularly saying yes to all the other things that they didn't know about. So according to Rashi, they were quite naive and they had a lot of trust. The Ramban says, no, the Torah is in order, and this portion is after the giving of the Ten Commandments, and therefore they were obeying. They were saying, we will do all the stuff that we've been told, which is already most of the Torah, all the Ten Commandments and all the things that go with that. So they weren't that naive, according to the Ramban, because they had a very good idea of the majority of what the Torah is. The Chizkuni, the third approach, says so far is they not only knew what they were getting involved in, but they even knew the fine print. They even knew what all the repercussions of doing the commandments were, all the consequences of doing it for good, and all the consequences of doing it for bad, all the ones mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. The Chizkuni assumes that there was no naivety. So that's some ways how classic commentaries will get out of this question by saying they weren't naive, they knew what they were getting involved in, according to the Ramban and Chizkuni. But according to Rashi, it's kind of a hard one. He's saying that they were very naive and they still said, we will do it. To me, that's not a hard question, because to me, it's not a good thing to be naive to a fellow human being. But when you're being naive to God, that's the best thing that you can be, in my opinion, because your wisdom is so inferior to what God's wisdom is that you almost have to give yourself over. It's almost, yes, God, I mean, even if you told me for the next 200 years, I still would know nothing relative to what really is out there. So yes, I'll say yes to whatever you tell me. And that's why I don't think the naive question is such a strong question when it's coming from God. Next thing, what do other thinkers say about the balance between naivety and trust? Again, Rashi's saying there was a lot of trust there with relation to God, but how do we relate that with the line between trust and being naive or being gullible to our fellow human beings? So Osho, who's this mystic guru who was from India, but he lived a lot of his life in America. There's been shows about him. He says it in a very nice way that I saw in video. He says the difference between trust and naivety is very great, but the line dividing the two is very, very thin. Either way, Osho predicts, you will be hurt. By trusting other people, you will be hurt. By being naive, you will be hurt. Either way, somewhere along the lines, your trust/naivety will hurt you. But he concludes that the difference between trust and naivety is that with trust, after someone has broken that trust, you won't lose trust for the next person. You'll only just feel compassion for the person who broke their trust, but shame for that person that they can't keep their word. But it doesn't break the way you see the rest of the world, because your trust is a solid thing. Whereas if you're naive and you're hurt, that's when you start blaming both yourself for being naive, as well as blaming someone else for being corruptive, and you'll just be left with hurt and not being able to trust other people again, and that's not a good thing to have. So I thought that that's quite a good way of saying it, that the difference between trust and naivety is that after you've been mistrusted, trust actually is a healing process for you. You continue to trust, whereas naivety allows you to go into a bad spiral where you start distrusting everyone else. That's one. Number two, Jordan Peterson. I think he's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He's got a lot of videos. He came out with a few books. And Jordan Peterson says that trust is one of our greatest resources. He starts off in his speech by saying he doesn't really believe in too many resources. He says, yes, air and water. Yes, those are two resources that everyone needs. But other than that, money and everything else, not as important as everybody thinks it is. That's his version. He says, but trust is a real resource that you need. And he mentioned, he didn't, in the video that I watched, exactly explain why trust is important, but he mentioned a practical example of youth today aren't getting the skills that maybe myself or yourselves got to build trust. He mentions going to people for barbecues on Sundays. And it's very common that all the kids go together, but they all go to the living room to watch TV. In the old days, there were no cell phones to escape to. There weren't big screen TVs that everyone watched. The kids were forced to play with each other, which he defined as trust each other. Because when you're a popular kid and you walk into the circle, you don't want to take over. You want to understand what's going on and build a trust that people trust in you to get involved in their game. So he goes through the dynamics of, child psychology, that technology isn't a bad thing in itself. Disney movies are fantastic, and there's a lot of other content out there that's fantastic. But if kids are just not relating to each other because they're just relating to a TV screen, it lacks the building of trust in young people, and he thinks that that's a very bad thing in terms of technology. Another professor from Northwestern University, this is the Kellogg University, I'm not sure where it is, but I think it's in Chicago. He mentions an experiment from 1995, which today has been known as the trust game. And it was very simple. The psychologist designed a game that one person and another person are relating to each other, and it could be online. It could be completely anonymous where no one sees each other, or it could be that you see each other, but it could be anonymous. And person A is told that he's got, let's say, for example, he's given $100. And he says that his mission is he can give however much he wants to person B, knowing that whatever he gives person B will be tripled. So if he gives all 100, person B will receive 300. If he gives only, half, the person B will get 150. And they did this experiment on lots of people, and they noticed that when person A gave the full amount to person B, then when person B had the exact opposite game to give back to A, they gave the full amount. They gave the full 300. But when people started being stingy and giving, $8, $80 or $60 or $40, they said the spiral of how little person B gave back was phenomenal. It wasn't relative to the amount given. It was much, much less. And that showed that when you didn't build that trust of person B thinking that person A actually, wants to be involved in person B, without trust, economically, it's very, very bad. It's almost like a game theory that in order to make things most efficient, you have to trust people the most. Lastly, just to end off with a famous quote that I always remember from many, many years ago. Darren Bassarabi was the one who shared this with me. He used to be the head of Jewish education at the Jewish schools, at least the informal content. And he shared with me that a professor from Brown University would say, actions influence your attitudes and your beliefs more than your attitudes and your actions influence your actions. So let me say that again. Actions influence your attitudes more than your attitude influences your actions. And the idea being, it's kind of one of those ideas of actions speak louder than words, where if you want to know something, get your feet wet. You can watch every video about surfing in the world. You can go to surf shops, you can smoothen boards, you can do whatever you want. But until you actually hit the water, you don't really experience what surfing is. You want to know what parenting is? Become a parent. You can read millions of books about parenting, and you can, be a professor of parenting, etc., etc. But there are certain blind spots that you have until you actually do the thing. And that's what I think one of the reasons why the Torah is trying to point out to us. That yes, there's an element of naivety that the Jewish people had, where we just accepted things that we didn't really know what they were going to be. But at the same time, the only way that you can really know something is by actually doing it. And how much time did a slave nation in Egypt have to actually learn high intellectual morality? That took probably years and years, maybe many, many generations. So yes, they said, let's get stuck in and let's learn it. And that's an important lesson for all of us. When you want to really experience something, just get your feet wet. And I always say this to people looking for careers, like young people who are looking for careers. Yes, you can do your legwork and you can do your homework, but go into a bank for a day and see how it is to work there. Somehow manage to intern there. Somehow managed to go to an economics firm. Somehow managed to become a dancer. and see what it is to dance and see what it is to do all these things. That will be your best experience. Next point. I started off with, is this a coincidence? I forgot to finish that thought. So the Christians gave the paragraphs and the verses. This verse is saying, actions speak louder than words. Go and do stuff. Just do it and you will understand. It happens to be that this is chapter 24, verse 7 of the book of Exodus. So I've heard many rabbis, not many, but I've heard a few point out to me, this is the overall commandment in the Torah. 24/7 na'aseh v'nishma. You need to active in order to understand, and you need to persevere 24/7. There is no such thing as rest. Yes, there is Shabbat. Shabbat is to rest, but there's no rest from becoming who you're really meant to be. You don't have a choice. You're living. Every moment is another opportunity and moment of your life. So live it up to the maximum. Go out. Do. And that's the lesson of 24/7. Whenever anyone says to you, what's the most important verse in the Torah? On Wednesday, I gave a few different examples. This could be one of them. Exodus chapter 24/7, verse 7. Go, na'aseh v'nishma. Go out and then you will understand. And then lastly, the last thought, this is my own thought about na'aseh v'nishma. Two thoughts. Number one is, you've got a whole lifetime to learn. Don't be in such a rush. Yes, it's great to try and be righteous. Yes, it's great to try and be a good person, a good parent, a good brother, a good child, a good worker, a good, etc., etc., etc. We're all striving for that. But it's not about what you are now, and it's not about what you are tomorrow. It's about that journey of getting there, because you don't flip a switch and become those things overnight. So when we said na'aseh, start slowly as a person. You want to become a good person. You want to become a charitable person. Don't save up to give 1,000 rand or $1,000. Save up a few dollars, and when you have the opportunity, give it, and then build it up more and more and more, where you actually are comfortable with giving $1,000 a month or whatever the case is. You don't have to be all or nothing, but the journey is there. The na'aseh is not what it is now. It's not like the people were saying, we're going to do everything right now, God. We're just learning what the Torah is. We're going to take it on all right now. Na'aseh, give us a chance. Hashem, give us a bit of slack. We'll take maybe our whole lives to understand things, but eventually we will begin to understand more and more. So that's one thought. And then the last thought is the word nishma. We will do and we will obey. There's different ways of saying nishma. Nishma, actually, the root of it is from the word shomea, which means listen or hear. So nishma can literally be translated as we will do and we will be heard. I think the moral of the story is that, yes, actions speak louder than words. Even if you're not feeling love for your wife or your husband or your family members or your friends, even if you're not feeling it, you feel hurt from them in the past, you feel like they don't go out the extra yard for you, you're not in a good space, whatever the case is, still call them to wish them happy birthday. Still, do some effort, call them to wish them good Shabbos. Do something, because even though some people might, question your sincerity, because you haven't said anything for the last 3 weeks, and all of a sudden you're sending flowers. But still, the action shows that you are on the person's mind. And that's why I wanted to say that actions speak louder than words, in the sense of actions show your sincerity. It might not be complete sincerity of feeling joy and wonder like the way you wanted to do, but someone will get the impression that you've done something for them by actually doing it. Because, you can have so many intentions of doing this, and you can struggle with yourself. Do I call the person? Do I not? I'm still upset. I'm waiting for them to call me back, blah, 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 blah. But if you just do the action, people will know that you've made the effort. They might not know that you're completely sincere, and they may doubt you in certain ways, but they definitely will doubt you less by the fact that you have done something. And that I also think is the nishma. Do it and you will be heard. Your action will show people that you care, even if you're not feeling it deep down inside. But as I mentioned before, even by doing it, it will bring you to a better place. So it's almost like a yin and a yang, a catch-22 of positivity. You do your actions even though you're not feeling it, but eventually you will feel it. And when you feel it, you'll be able to do your actions with sincerity. So that's a nice circle over there. Thank you all for being here. We're now going to go to the Shabbat service, and we will say a prayer for the sick, and we'll do a Yizkor as well.